Hey there, podcasters and listeners, and today we have got some important news to discuss that directly impacts the podcasting community. If you haven't heard already, our friends over at Stitcher recently sent out an email. They are shutting down. In this episode, we will explore what this means for podcasters and why it's crucial not to put all of your podcast eggs in one basket. For those of you who are new to the show, it is wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode, whether you are listening on a podcast directory or you are watching on YouTube. It's great to have you here. And for everybody who is coming back, and this is not your first time listening to the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting, it's amazing to have you here as well. I'm Verity and I am a podcast enthusiast, hence hosting this podcast, The Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. So let's dive right in. Stitcher is a very popular podcast app and website, and it is ceasing operations on August 29th of August 2023. So what does this mean for podcasters, you might be asking? Well, for one thing, your listeners will not be able to access your show lists, download their preferences, or their listening history after that date on Stitcher. The app will be no more. It just won't be working. Now, anything that is currently on Stitcher, however, will be redirected to their sister app, Pandora. And whilst your podcast will continue to be distributed to any other podcast directories that you have set it up to be distributed from your podcast hosting platform, it's important to remember that your podcast will no longer be available via Stitcher from the 29th of August. And this is regardless where you are in the world. So this kind of brings me on to the point of why using just one podcasting platform is a really risky thing to do. If that platform suddenly disappears, then your podcast is gone with it. And, we've seen this happen before with other podcast directories just disappearing and platforms vanishing without warning, leaving people to kind of think, well, what am I supposed to promote my podcast on now? It's a harsh reality, but I've said this time and time again, you need to diversify your podcast distribution. It really is the key to survival in your industry. So it's about having that strategy behind you and making sure that you really are everywhere when it comes to your podcast. So my biggest ones that I always say are Apple Podcasts and Spotify, because statistically at least 40% of your podcast listeners will come from Apple Podcasts and around 20 to 30% of them will come from Spotify. So it's making sure that your podcast is available on multiple directories. And I will say this till I'm blue in the face, but at the very, very least, you need to be on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Both of these platforms have got absolutely massive audiences. And by being there, you can significantly increase your reach and exposure of your podcast and increase your listenership. It is not enough to just be on multiple platforms. You need to inform your listeners about this transition, particularly if they are listening to you on Stitcher. If you've got a big community of listeners on Stitcher, you need to be letting them know where else they can be listening to your podcast. What you don't want to do is just assume that they're going to search for you on a different directory. And what actually happens is they kind of just fall off your bandwagon instead. So you can use your podcast episodes that are upcoming to share the news of where you are going to be having your podcast hosted, which directories that you can be found on. You can also put something on your website, for example, on your social media to make sure that people are aware where they can listen to your podcast. And don't forget as well to remove any Stitcher branding or links from your podcast description, show notes, and website. If you've got a really extensive back catalogue and it's just going to be really exhausting for you to go through every single episode show notes and remove anything mention of Stitcher, then I wouldn't stress too much. I would say from this point forward, just make sure there's no mention of Stitcher going forward. However, if you do have a smaller back catalogue where it's easier to take any Stitcher references out, then I might be inclined to do that just to save any confusion. And the reason why I said that is because I know somebody who's got a podcast, for example, and in some of their earlier episodes, they have got links to courses which are hosted on a completely different platform now, and they didn't go back and change those links over, and it causes them such a headache every time somebody is trying to access a course on a platform that it's not even hosted on anymore. And I spoke to them recently and they said, oh, I need to go and change those links. So it's just, it does become bothersome if you don't change the links or put in some kind of redirect, but you're not going to be in charge of a Stitcher redirect. So you're going to want to inform your listeners as to where else they can listen to you other than Stitcher. And what I would really take from this is, as I said, just don't put all of your eggs in one basket or podcast episodes on one platform. Don't just have one directory. What this does is it really serves us as a way of not being complacent and assuming that everything will stay the same forever. So yes, when people go to Stitcher, they will be redirected to Pandora. Not everybody uses Pandora as their podcasting directory. So it is really, really important to make sure that you are in a whole different host of places, in my opinion, in order to make sure that your podcast is as accessible as it possibly can be, because you don't want to be losing listeners just because a platform is shutting down. For example, if Apple Podcasts shut down tomorrow and they redirected me to a different platform that I don't listen to my podcast on, I'm not necessarily going to want to follow that redirect. I will probably go and listen on a different platform such as Spotify, for example. And if your podcast isn't there, then I'm not really it's not my responsibility to be going around all the different directories trying to find your podcast. Stitcher is closing. You don't need to stress too much about this, because if anyone were to click on any Stitcher links, then they will be redirected to Pandora. However, I would really, really take this as a time to just really consider which podcasting directories you are on and making sure that you are on as many as possible. I've done an episode previously looking at what is the difference between your podcast hosting platform and your podcast directories. I'll get that linked down for you below in the show notes so that you can have a listen to that episode. But as I said, it's important to be in as many places as possible. And it's remembering as well, getting on so many directories is actually really, really easy. For the most part of it, it is setting up your RSS feed that one time, or a lot of podcast hosting platforms now, they've actually got one-click setup, which makes it even easier. And I know that in this world, we are always going on, don't be everywhere. And that is one thing for social media. But when it comes to podcast distribution, you do want to be everywhere. You do want to be in as many places as possible. So on that note, I'm going to leave you for this episode. I hope as ever you found it enjoyable and useful, and let me know, are you going to be affected by the Stitcher app closing? Are your listeners going to be affected, or actually does it not bother you that much because you've already got that strategy in place and got your podcast on a whole load of different hosting platforms, on a whole load of different podcast directories? I'd love to hear from you as ever at Verity Songon on Twitter and Instagram. And otherwise, I will see you next episode.